This morning, our first speaker is Rev'd Dr. Tom Curran, who is a tutor in the King's Foundation Year program in Halifax. He's also the chair of faculty and clerk of convocation at King's, and he assists Father Ingalls at the King's College Chapel. Tom has been a key and keen member of the Atlantic Theological Conference Committee for many years, and he has a keen interest in contemporary culture. And I often think that his unique perspective on life is due to his heritage. Even though he's 100% grade A Canadian Anglican, his father was Irish and his mother German. And I think that gives him an interesting perspective on life. And his dear mother passed away just this year. And whenever he was traveling to Germany to see his mother, who lived to be a great age, she'd ask, "How's Gorby?" And that meant me, because not because she thought I was like the Canadian national bird, which is, you know, the Whiskey Jack or Canada Jay, but because she thought I looked like Mikhail Gorbachev. So she obviously had, like Tom, a great sense of humor. So we welcome Father Curran and look forward very much to his presentation this morning. Oh, and by the way, his wife Kara is here today with us. And we welcome her as well. And she's the niece of Dr. Mary Smith, who was participating in our conferences as well, and the granddaughter of the rector of St. James Armdale. So another grade A Canadian Anglican.
I'll try this one last time and then I'll give up. Introductions should only be extended after the speaker has spoken, because the inflation factor at the beginning means you're heading for a balloon that's going to be pricked during the talk. And I thank Canon Matheson for agreeing to parse the remarks to a factual package. That's what I want to say. My qualifications for addressing this year's Atlantic Theological Conference on this theme derive from the fact that I have successfully completed a course run by the World Health Organization. This would be in a moment for applause, actually. A course completion assessed by means of multi-choice testing, in which I achieved the required satisfactory passing grade. The title of the course is identified as, quote, Infodemic Management 101. And by the way, everything I'm saying here is factual. I want to make that absolutely clear. I have received an official record from the World Health Organization, an achievement which I proudly display outside my study door. Unfortunately, at the conclusion of these remarks, some of you may come to the view that far from combating whatever the World Health Organization regards as infodemic, these observations this morning may actually be part of the disease and not at all part of the cure. Instead of combating the problem, I may actually be adding to it and furthering the viral spread of either, or rather both, disinformation and misinformation. You have been warned. This partly explains the rather odd title which has been appended as the introduction to my remarks this morning: Twin Pandemics, Online and in Person. I'm not a plagiarist, so I now confess but the actual origin of this title lies in my frequent walking past an impressive and prospering religious conventicle, which offers captivating suggestions to the faithful by way of something called a readograph. And please take this fact as an indication of the diligent research which underlines this morning's remarks, since never heard of this thing before. It is called a readograph. This is the precise technical name for this object, which permits changes of lettering on weatherproofed fiberglass signage. I have often been compelled to stop in my tracks in order to take a photograph of the latest edifying message on display. And nothing has surpassed the Easter message. The inspiring communication was, quote, Christ is risen, online and in person. Fact. I've spent a long time pondering exactly what substantial content this particular message might actually be conveying. Is this a new form of Christian dualism in which the distinction between spirit and matter is recognized as absolute? Are these, shall we say, alternatives, online and in person? Are they separate but supposedly equal? Or is this a recognition instead that our existence as bodies in motion has finally been effectively resolved in our access to real-time, remote congregating, socializing, and learning? Or have we in fact now attained the final and most perfect stage of our required social distancing? This is also fact. Next thing I'm going to say. Andy Warhol, a true clairvoyant, suggested 35 years ago, that actual physical presence is vastly overrated. I'm only going to read a very small portion of what he then wrote, and this is a citation. To carry on friendships or to cash checks or to buy clothes, you can just make a phone call or send a computer message. To give court testimony or to look for a date or even read your own will after you're dead, you can send a videotape. Now, I know this is probably old hat to you, but the first time that Kara deposited a check, physical object, into a bank without ever going to the bank and sending a photograph, I'm sorry, that blew my mind. And that was 3.5 weeks ago, not 35 years ago. In this preface to his party book, so-called, Andy suggested that there were actually only 2 reasons physically to bring your lump of protoplasm and get it close to somebody else's. Since this is the preface to the title, Andy Warhol's party book, the second component is obviously parties. And this being a hallowed institution, the first opportunity I leave to your imagination. The second component has been successfully eliminated for much of the COVID regime by what are apparently called virtual party invitations. And please note that Andy could never have found that satisfactory. And my impression is that Andy would not have been much impressed by the other option either, if you see what I mean. Already in 1979, so much earlier than 35 years ago, Andy Warhol had identified himself as a victim of what he labeled as social disease, a condition which he describes as follows, quotation. Andy says, I have social disease. I have to go out every night. If I stay home one night, I start spreading rumors to my dogs. Well, as you see, this is the era of COVID, we have solved the problem of our social disease now as well. By way of Facebook and its 5 subsidiary satellite operations, by which I mean Instagram, WhatsApp, Oculus VR, Onavo, and Beluga. And again, this is factual. This is not making any of this up. The only thing I would add is that the last name Beluga is clearly particularly apt, since it suggests a whale that is going to swallow just about everything else, which is my view. All of these subsidiary enterprises are owned by Facebook, or at least that social media enterprise, formerly known as formerly known as Facebook. And all of these 5 acquisitions, Instagram, WhatsApp, Oculus VR, Onavo, Bulaga, were subsumed under Facebook on the principle that, and remember that we are here discussing the global enterprise formerly known as Facebook. All of these were subsumed under Facebook because the strategy was to buy all potential rivals before they can get too big. Presumably, something at some point could possibly rival Facebook or endanger its world domination with its 2.8 billion users, which is to say 36% of the world's population, including babies and people who can't deal with their phones because they're too old. 2.8 billion users of active age and capacity are using Facebook. And these 6 companies are able between them to provide a completely social media dominated globe. But not just social media. As you know, Instagram, photo and video sharing, WhatsApp, mobile messaging, Oculus VR, entrance into virtual reality. And the best one is Onavo. It's called Customer User Analytics, also known to the rest of us as spyware. And finally, in Beluga, of which I'd never previously heard, even though it was acquired in 2011, which provided Facebook with its messaging platform. As aptly named, of course, as the beluga whale. As I say, it is presumably going to devour and consume everything else. And John has already received the truth, because I understand all of this sounds a bit exotic and bizarre, a bit like the James Bond film Never Say Never Again, 1983, in which 007 learns to play a 3D video game, so-called, again, a sign of things to come, called domination. The object of this game so-called, is domination of the world. But like the title of the film itself, Never Say Never Again, in the case of Facebook, this is sadly no joke. At the level of the movies, this allows me to say that the first point that needs to be made about Facebook's quest for global domination or world domination, again, I want to say 2.8 million users, which is 36% of the total world population. In other words, more than 1 in every 3 persons alive today uses Facebook. Now, slightly critical moment. This visionary company had its origins as the film The Social Network, 2010, also makes absolutely clear. This visionary company, intent on world domination, in its initial conception, discovered the principles of this global empire. This is a fact, as a way to optimize the objectification of female Harvard students. And are we actually expected to support and celebrate something like that. Mark Zuckerberg, incidentally, his name is literally a reference to Sugar Mountain, or perhaps as I prefer, Big Rock Candy Mountain. Zuckerberg apparently wants to create and dominate by both the sweet and the artificial. Well, in case you're missing the point of all this, in October 2021, Zuckerberg made it all very clear. The controlling corporation of all these five companies under the Facebook umbrella are now collectively known as Meta Incorporated. And I confess I find that kind of disturbing. Is it really all that long ago? Really just a decade ago, May 2013, that Edward Snowden revealed to the world the place in your lives of metadata. So he explains metadata is the information that our devices generate about what we do with them and what they do without our awareness. And these are his direct words. This is not some benign abstraction, but the very essence of its content. It is precisely the first line of information that the party surveilling you requires. I am trying to make a connection between Meta Inc. and metadata. Snowden again. After learning of stellar wind, which is the thing he blew the whistle on, Snowden apparently fell into a depression. Quote, "I felt far from home, but monitored." Perhaps this is the moment to turn off your phones, possibly. "I felt more adult than ever, but also cursed with the knowledge that all of us had been reduced to something like children who'd been forced to live the rest of our lives under omniscient parental supervision. In stellar wind, the US government was developing the capacity of an eternal law enforcement agency. At any time, the government could dig through the past communications of anybody it wanted to victimize in search of a crime. And everybody's communications contain evidence of something. So in my opinion, when the CEO decides to rename his iron-fisted grip on the world of mobile communications, 1 in 3 persons alive on the planet today, what precisely is he choosing to tell us? Zuckerberg has explained. The overall idea is to use virtual reality, VR, Oculus, technology as developed by the then Facebook subsidiary Oculus Rift, to reimagine the internet as a series of spaces you could walk or float around, as opposed to just being a series of sites you click around. Direct quotation from Zuckerberg. He said he wanted to create the feeling that you're really there with another person in another place. And then he later elaborated, also direct quotation, instead of just viewing content, you are in it. Zuckerberg and Facebook are not exactly pioneers of this type of technology, which is not made clear by him. So whatever spin he puts on it, we now come to the Atlantic Theological Conference moment in these ranting remarks about the condition of our world. Zuckerberg and his firm did not invent this technology. It is my pleasure to be able to tell you that the motion picture reality titled, and I, again, I'm not making this up, the title of this work is Jesus VR, which was revealed to the world at the Venice Film Festival in 2016. This VR experience creates a virtual bubble of moving images you can stand inside by strapping on a VR headset. please note, instead of just viewing content, you are in it. Obviously, this was at a primitive stage of this development, but nonetheless, it was successful because Venice had then, for the festival, a dedicated virtual reality suite with 30 headsets and swishy white rotating chairs, indicating that even though this is online, hope I'm making my point, VR films are actually a solitary experience. They're artificial and fictional. Nevertheless, this film, Jesus VR, indicated there was a potential gravy train Hollywood is determined not to miss. Now, I'm dedicated to research, but I was not able to get to Venice in 2016. So I'm simply going to read what a critic said about it. And I mean, this is nauseating, so perhaps we need to get a handkerchief. Quote, "In the Last Supper scene, I struggled to pay attention to Jesus's words because I was so distracted by the disciples." And the idea is that if you turn your head this way and that way in the chair and so forth, you can actually see everyone in a 360 degree projection of everyone that's there and what everyone is doing. So to make sure that you're nauseous, I'm going to repeat this. In the Last Supper scene, I struggled to pay attention to Jesus's words because I was so distracted by the disciples, who all seemed to be switching randomly between two facial expressions: beard twirling solemnity and sea bass mouthed astonishment. There's more nauseating coming. I mean, this, I don't know if I can't read this. It's too depressing. It's better in the critics. I'm just going to give her it's too upsetting. During the crucifixion scene, which of course is central to the film called Jesus VR, the critic couldn't actually enter into the spirit of the scene because he was completely distracted by a jeering bystander who looked like the leader of the Labour Party in England or Britain. So I'm introducing you to the new piety, online and in person. Now, I'd like to horrify you even more, especially those people who know Kings. Imagine a Zoom faculty meeting which you could attend in a swivel chair. I don't think you accept the real horror of this. And all of this is intended to make us more partial to so-called online worship. I ask, are we going to be like some kind of utopian nightmare where we have to be winched out of second-story windows because the only parts of our bodies that are still in motion and that have any kind of ongoing worldly presence are our fingers and hands, and sometimes presumably also our mouths? And another thing I would like to emphasize, which was put beautifully in a recent issue of Harper's Magazine, every time you update your devices, you are in fact reaffirming your consent to be monitored by these very devices. So when you slavishly accept the update, which we all do, and by the way, I know that I'm very shallow and facile. I know that you all read the agreements. Harper's Magazine. This data is going to be used for anything other, sorry, misreading. Harper's Magazine says, at the moment, we needn't worry too much because, of course, the main function of all this updating is so that we can be micro-targeted for advertising. But there is the possibility that even our purchases, which provide all this data, could become the object of supervision. For instance, your online purchases could be echo-rated. Already, Harpers tells us, we are learning not only that social media activity can be monetized, but that even when a person does not directly cash in on the clout they have acquired online, their presence there is itself still the basis of a newly emerging economy, itself a kind of money. And again from Harpers, the starkest transformation that we have experienced is the one we would likely have had trouble anticipating before 2020, the commandment to stay at home, which unbelievably transformed into a norm of the permanent pandemic. During the lockdowns, the lack of access to libraries with physical books, the lack of access to coffee shops and gymnasiums did not improve our lives, and in fact, may have made some of us ill. I'm leaving aside our lack of access to music and to worship and just about everything else we hold important, including being present when our family members were ill or dying. And I stress again, I'm not making any of this up. I appeal to your own experience, but also to what is generally available to us through journalistic enterprises. Zuckerberg, the missionary, has explained that Meta, the new, more aptly named Facebook, is literally collecting a million little pieces. Every decision you make can at least be captured as metadata, and every site you visit and every purchase you make can be micro-targeted for advertising, and at the same time, of course, monetized. And then I simply repeat, you're not just viewing content, you are in it. Zuckerberg wants to create the feeling, apparently, that the feeling that you're really there with another person and in another place. Well, I don't feel that in online worship. I understand that television masses for shut-ins have their place, but I don't want to live there until I'm older. Next week. And I ask you, is this utopia or dystopia? What does it mean for the future of the chief function of our ecclesiastical lives? The gathering of the community for our common prayer, our common worship, our participation in Christ's Last Supper. As you have just heard, enjoy these last moments of Christ's life directly in Christ's company itself, in Jesus VR, where you can apparently be online and in person at one and the same time. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. But in my opinion, the proposal for Meta Incorporated will bring it with it more revolutionary changes than Neil Armstrong's stepping onto the moon ever conceived possible. With VR, under Meta supervision, all of you can walk on the moon and return safely without worrying about oxygen levels. One small click for the user, one giant immersion for mankind. Or is it one small click for the user, one giant advance in the monetization of all human activity? I'd like to stress, I'm not here to alarm or inhibit any enterprises that people undertake to keep our religion alive, but I am asking you to consider the possibility that we are entering the age of what I call the new piety, online, since it's so much better than in person. It appears that Mark Zuckerberg is proposing to traverse the final frontier between spirit and body, between online and in person, by inserting us into the so-called metaverse. Zuckerberg's conversion of the app, formerly known as Facebook, into the regeneration of the world, by what Zuckerberg calls meta. This is presumably a snappy, appy way of suggesting the next stage in the evolution of mankind in this dystopian future. Or is it perhaps making a statement about virtual reality being at least as attractive as living out a life in the unmessy and unhappy passage of time which you are experiencing, but this will come to an end quite shortly. This is real time, and therefore it will have a conclusion. Now, the next part, I would like to assure you, is not based on anything to do with my profound knowledge of jurisprudence. Case was brought to my attention, which has made some tracks in the COVID era. It is a published judgment, and all of this will be available to you in footnotes in due course, possibly even soon, in which a case was tried and the judgment released on February the 2nd of this year, 2022, in Ontario's Superior Court. But in fact, the trial was in the family court. And it's an application between JN and CG, or as we would say in non-professional parlance, JN versus CG. And in my opinion, this judgment, which is available online, affects all of us. The circumstances are well known and present to everybody. Father and mother separated. The judgment makes clear that when the parties signed the minutes of settlement for their separation, they already knew that they disagreed about the issue of vaccinations. But as with everything else, things become more complicated in the era of COVID. February 2022, the father wants 2 children, ages 12 and 10, to receive COVID vaccinations. The mother is opposed. This is all taken directly from the judgment, by the way. The mother denied being an anti-vaxxer, but expressed concerns about the COVID vaccination guarantees. And there are surely questions the judge allowed. Now, again, I'm moving outside my comfort zone, but there are issues about COVID vaccinations. The first is whatever a spike protein is, it's engaged in the administration of the vaccination, and it doesn't have a long history so that we can know exactly what its consequences are. But I can only speak anecdotally. Having been vaccinated 3 times, and therefore in excess of being fully vaccinated, I promptly contracted COVID. I'd like to add, I was glad to be vaccinated. I've now been vaccinated 4 times, but I note that whatever was promised for those fully vaccinated, in political parlance, apparently fully vaccinated means 2 vaccinations. I caught COVID after exceeding what was regarded as fully vaccinated. So at least we can say, when we were naively told in the middle of 2020 that when these vaccinations arrived, we would be in a completely different world. You can still catch COVID. The first 3 points in the justice's judgment read as follows. These are quotations. When did it become illegal to ask questions, especially in the courtroom? Second point. And when did it become unfashionable for judges to receive answers, especially when children's lives are at stake? The third point. How did we lower our guard and let the words unacceptable beliefs get paired together in a democracy on the scales of justice? Because in the case, which you can follow yourselves, and it's online, I'll give you the URL, the judge explains that the main point of contention was that the mother was unfit to raise children and make medical decisions about her children because she had political views that were outside the mainstream. But the judge explains, quote, both parents relied extensively on unsworn exhibits, which were basically internet downloads. Now, we're living in a different world now where a case could be decided, or at least it's thought it should be decided on the basis of internet downloads. Now, occasionally I'd like to see a doctor, as opposed to reading about my condition online, but in the year of COVID, I have a skin problem, which I found extremely upsetting, and it is impossible to see a specialist. So what do? I found out what I have online. Very, very helpful and calming. Judge continues, in addition, the father relied on numerous downloads from the mother's social media accounts. So they're entered into evidence. Both parents consented to my receiving these materials to demonstrate the sources of information which each of them is relying on in formulating their respective parenting position. Now, I hope this is disturbing you a little bit. So first thing is, I suggest some of you shut down your Twitter account. You don't even have to wait till the end of my remarks. You can do it right now. Might be safer. How many politicians have you heard of whose careers have been ruined by some unguarded Twitter comment? Do we have to name them all? Surely you're aware of the danger of this. Point 17 in the judgment, the mother's evidence focused entirely on medical and scientific issues. Point 18, in contrast, the father focused extensively on labeling and discrediting the mother as a person because of her social media posts, in a dismissive attempt to argue that her views aren't worthy of consideration. The judge concludes, this odious trend is rapidly corrupting modern social discourse. Ridicule and stigmatize your opponent as a person rather than dealing with the ideas they want to talk about. And the most damning piece of evidence inserted into the trial, the father attached a photograph of PPC leader Maxime Bernier addressing an audience. Do we have to say anything else? Now, there is something we need to deal with here. The judge says in the conclusion, how is any of this relevant? Have we reached the stage where parental rights are going to be decided based on which political party you belong to? Is being seen with Maxime Bernier, or anyone for that matter, the kiss of death as far as your court case is concerned? This is the judge, not me. Can you simply utter the words conspiracy theorist and do a mic drop? So to return to the beginning of the judgment, the judge said to delegitimize questions and strategically avoid giving answers. Blanket denials are almost never acceptable in our adversarial system. Each party always has the onus to prove the case, and yet misinformation has crept into the court lexicon. I have to cut some of this out. But in the judgment, the word demonizing and punishing anyone who disagrees appears. Now, I like to think of myself as providing helpful modern information, and I'm going to present it in this form. In many tobacco packaging products, you will read the statement, smoking kills. I would like to add, possibly as a reminder in the pew, living also kills. And, you know, in a sense, that's what we're trying to face in this conference, the fact that we live in an era in which our common welfare is the form by which we can be further torn apart. I'm going to give some examples. If there is a hero that I would like to acknowledge in these remarks, it is the practitioner in Wuhan who first tried to alert the Chinese Communist Party officials with the evidence of a respiratory viral disease for which this physician was both politically criticized and inhibited. And I want to give you a much more direct account of this. It would be best if I actually quoted the words, but the doctor in question, who died on the 6th of February, 2020, you see this is quite early on in the advance of COVID, was required to, here it is. The doctor in question, an ophthalmologist in Wuhan, was the first to warn people about the new virus. On the 30th of December, 2019, he messaged a group of colleagues about a possible outbreak. A few days later, he was summoned by the police and reprimanded, quote, for making false statements that disturbed the public order. Now, I think this man is a saint. Lee continued his work at the hospital on the 10th of January, 2020, started experiencing symptoms of infection. On the 6th of February, his heart stopped. Several news outlets immediately reported his death, and the country began to mourn. The correspondent who lives in Wuhan said, "I've never seen anything like it on social media. Everyone was sharing the story, praising Lee's bravery as a whistleblower. Many said they'd hoped it was only a rumor, that he was still with us. And then suddenly new information popped up. Apparently, Lee remained on life support and in the hospital, which was working to revive him. At this announcement, the previously united mourners split into several camps. Some sincerely prayed for his recovery. Others condemned the media's earlier reports of his death as thriving on human blood. The rest of us had suspicions about what was going on and were furious. The mock salvation ended in the early hours of the morning of February the 7th, which became the official date of his death. When you wake up hearing the same news for a second time, you may still be angry, but perhaps without the same level of shock. Now, the reason for bringing that to your attention in a bit more detail is that I want to make it clear that the social media world which we inhabit has benefits and negative impact. Not wishing to suggest we turn back the clock, clearly a lot of this information would not come to us if it hadn't been for social media, and the capacity for cover-up is in fact reduced even for the Chinese Communist Party. As you know, Donald Trump labeled the COVID disease from which we are all suffering as the Chinese virus in the early part of March 2020. If you were being sympathetic, you would say, well, it's not really different from the Spanish flu. Suppose we could be sued for using that language by the Spaniards, but nobody seems to think that Spain is somehow personally culpable in any way, or any particular Spaniard for the flu that developed. But I accept that from people I've talked to, that the language of the Chinese virus was very hurtful if one regarded it as a racial slur. Vanity Fair magazine, which I would like to suggest to you is as un-Trumpian as any publication produced in the United States of America. The reason for that is it's written exclusively for people who live in Boston, New York, Washington, or Philadelphia, or alternatively, San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, Seattle. And everything in between is simply a flyover. It's on the map of the United States just to fill in the spaces, but has no actual relevance. Unfortunately, the people being flown over, 70 million voters, haven't actually got the message. And they are, shall we say, potentially resentful of being treated as hicks and rednecks and so on. And I simply repeat a statistic, which is that Trump received more votes in this last election than any other president of the United States except Joe Biden. So that's a large number of people, a lot of Facebook users, and their votes do count. The purpose of stressing all of this, and I promised that I would give an actual intro to the reflections, which we profounder and deeper than anything I have to say, is that I think there is an imperative being placed upon us to consider how we use our social media. Now I have to find my conclusion. Just give me a moment. I hope you see a lot of pages I've skipped. Yes, a little bit of credit. But I can't find the conclusion, which is here somewhere. Would be best if I quoted it as opposed to just, nope. All right, we're doing this all from memory. The first point is that we are intended by our Lord and Savior, or at least his followers, to exercise courtesy and discipline in our relations with others. Now, we are in a religious community, which means we are well aware of controversy. And when we become controversialists, even in the era of the Reformation, occasionally things are said that might be thought extreme or hurtful. And so while I am a devoted follower of Martin Luther, doesn't mean I have to agree with every single statement he's ever made. And it is, to me, as we say, makes me uncomfortable that in the Anglican Church, we continue to read passages from the Epistle of St. James, because it shouldn't be in Scripture at all. It shouldn't be canonical. It does not understand the nature of the gospel, and indeed, in a way, buries the gospel message under some kind of Aristotelian veneer, which is demonic. But I would like you to take on board the possibility that 9 words in the epistle summarize the entire character of our Christian life. Okay, it's not going to get you to heaven, but it's still important. Swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. I mean, would it hurt you if you did that? It's not going to get you to heaven. Quite clear on that. It's not part of the gospel. But is it offensive in any way? And is it worthy of being consigned to an epistle of straw? It should be exhumed from the canonical scriptures. The second point, I promised I would do it, is a reference to the Tower of Siloam, which is next to the Pool of Siloam. And it's of profound interest to me because it's an actual reference to a historical reality in which Jesus lived and about which people were talking in a kind of social media sense. 18 people died when this tower collapsed. And the question was, what was the provocation for the tower? And were they there because they were being punished in some way? And Jesus says, they're like everybody else. I'm sorry, I have the passage, but I can't find it. You will make good what I failed to do. They just were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I'd also like to recommend at this point, The Bridge of Saint Louis Ray by Thornton Wilder, written in 1924, a reflection on these questions that has never been bettered, in my opinion, anywhere. Again, why were these 4 people on the bridge when it collapsed? So we're not blaming anybody for COVID. We are not suggesting that some people live lives worse than others. And key point of this is there is no room for shaming people on social media. If there's a takeaway from these remarks in COVID, which has exponentially increased our capacity in society to be at war with one another. And what I've left out here, which I just insert now very briefly, is the notion of person years. Is the life of a young person per year worth more than the life of an old timer like me? Shouldn't the resources of society be directed towards those who have the potential for a long life, as opposed to, yes, I'll just get my cane out for, I mean, you know, should I have a hip replacement, which is very expensive, when the money can be used for so many other productive purposes? Of course, since I have fewer years than a young person, I think every year is more valuable. Yes, but that's the inverse of the argument. And furthermore, it is a serious argument because it has been mooted relative to the virtues of assisted medical dying, that by removing yourself from the equation, you are opening up resources for the health service in Nova Scotia. This is actually an argument that has been made, and you might want to read Brave New World, which discusses that as well. So what I am trying to suggest is that for the next week or so, could you resist pushing the send button for 12 hours? Okay, I agree it won't be right in the face of the person receiving it, but the content could still be the same, and it might be done more courteously. I mean, who would it hurt if you did that? I had a friend who enjoyed sending what he called eyeball peeling emails. I've seen some, I've received some. Yes, there's been damage to my eye here, I can tell you that. But what is the effect of this? It wasn't politically or practically useful. It was harmful in the sense that it undermined his cause, and its only real purpose was to engender hurt. And that's not what we're about. And the final words, if I can find them, belong to Andy Warhol. I have to find the exact words. Again, this is a paraphrase, but it's pretty close. I think everybody should be nice to everybody else.